I was sitting in the kitchen when I found the letter. Not the kind of letter you get in the mail. This one was handwritten, folded in half, tucked inside a zipped pocket of the duffel bag my son-in-law had left by the back door when he came to pick up my daughter for dinner. The bag was half open. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for the car charger he'd borrowed 2 weeks before and never returned, and there it was. I didn't open it right away. I stood there in the kitchen with the fluorescent light buzzing above the stove, the way it always does when the temperature drops below 40, and I looked at the folded paper for a long time. The handwriting on the outside was my daughter's. Her name, just her first name, in that looping cursive she's had since middle school. I put it back, zipped the pocket, set the bag down exactly where I'd found it. They came home around 9. My daughter laughed at something he said as they came through the door, and I watched her face the way you do when you're looking for something you hope you won't find. She looked fine. She looked happy even. But there are things a father learns to see in 63 years of living, and one of them is the difference between a woman who is happy and a woman who has decided to perform happiness so well that even she believes it. I went to bed. I didn't sleep. Let me back up. Because the letter didn't come from nowhere, and I want you to understand that. My daughter is 41 years old. She is the kind of person who remembers birthdays without being reminded, who calls her mother's friends after a hospital stay, who once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to help a college roommate move out of an apartment she shouldn't have been in. She is, in every way I know how to measure, a good person. Better than me. Better than most. She married her husband 8 years ago in a small ceremony outside Asheville, North Carolina, in early October when the leaves were just turning. I walked her down that path between the chairs and the apple trees, and I shook his hand, and I meant it. He was a contractor. He worked hard. He was quiet in a way I respected. Not cold, just careful with words, which is something I understand because I'm the same way. My wife passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. My daughter moved back into the house for the last 6 months, sleeping in her old room down the hall, waking up at 2 in the morning when the monitors beeped. Her husband stayed in their place in Charlotte, 2.5 hours away. Because of work. That's what they said. Because of work. I noticed things then. Small things. The way my daughter went quiet when his name came up. The way she held her phone, screen down on the kitchen table, whenever she was reading something. The way she said, "He's fine," when I asked how he was doing. Not "he's good," or "he says hi," but "he's fine." The way you talk about weather that isn't threatening but isn't right, either. After my wife passed, my daughter went home. Her husband picked her up. I stood in the driveway and watched them pull out, and I thought, I'm going to find out what's wrong in that house. Not because I'm the kind of man who interferes. Because I'm the kind of man who finishes what he starts, and something in me had already started. I didn't say anything. Not then. That was 18 months ago. The letter stayed in my head for 2 weeks. I told myself it was nothing. A card, maybe. Something personal. Not my business. People write things down. Married couples have private communication that doesn't involve their fathers-in-law, and that's how it should be. But I kept coming back to one thing. Why was a letter from my daughter to her husband, in her handwriting, tucked inside his bag? In his bag, not in a drawer, not on a counter. Folded and zipped into a hidden pocket like something you'd carry when you're not sure you'll be coming back. I went back to Charlotte that weekend under the pretense of helping him fix a section of fence that had come down in the wind. He seemed glad to see me. He made coffee. We worked for most of the afternoon, and I watched him the way I'd watched him at the wedding, looking for what was under the careful surface. Around 3 o'clock, while he was inside washing up, I walked to his truck, not because I had a plan. I want to be clear about that. I'm not the type to go through a man's things. But I walked to that truck the way you walk towards something your body knows about before your mind has caught up, and I looked through the window, and there on the passenger seat, not hidden, just sitting there, was a stack of papers. Printed emails. I could see the header of the top one, through the glass. The name on it wasn't my daughter's. I stood there for a moment, then I went back to working on the fence. I've been in law enforcement. Not recently. I retired from the Raleigh PD in 2017 after 31 years. I spent the last decade of my career in financial crimes, which means I learned how to build a case before I ever made a move. You don't confront. You document. You wait. You let people show you what they're hiding, because they always will, given enough time and enough silence. I started paying attention differently after that afternoon. I began to notice the trips. He traveled for work. That part was real. He did renovation projects up and down the I-85 corridor, sometimes gone for weeks at a time. But I started cross-referencing what my daughter told me about where he was with what I could verify through basic public records and a little patience. Property permit filings, contractor license registrations, county inspection logs. What I found was that about 30% of his work trips didn't correspond to any active permits in the areas he claimed to be. I didn't tell my daughter. I want to explain that choice because I know it's the one people will question. If I had gone to her in that moment and said, "I think your husband is lying about where he goes," she would have one of two reactions. Either she would defend him, which would close the door and make her feel she had to choose sides, or she would confront him, which would give him time to cover his tracks and possibly make the situation worse before I understood the full shape of it. I had a grandson to think about. Their boy was 7 years old at the time. He has his mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubbornness, and he doesn't deserve to be the casualty of a decision made in the wrong order. So I kept quiet, and I kept watching. By March, I had enough to know the basic shape of what was happening. There was a woman in Greenville, South Carolina. They'd been seeing each other for somewhere between 2 and 3 years, based on what I could piece together. She was someone he'd met through a job, a client, originally. The relationship had clearly moved well past professional. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was the money. He had opened a second LLC under a name I almost missed, one letter different from his primary business. Through that shell, he had been routing payments for materials and labor on jobs that, as far as I could tell, were either grossly inflated or partially fictitious. Some of the money appeared to be going into a personal account I couldn't tie to any joint asset my daughter was aware of. I'm not a forensic accountant, but I spent 10 years watching people hide money, and I know what it looks like when someone is building a runway. He was planning to leave, not impulsively, methodically. The kind of leaving you plan 18 months in advance, so that by the time it happens, the assets are already gone. My daughter had no idea. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with the specific weight of knowing something about the person your child loves that your child doesn't know. It doesn't feel like power. It feels like carrying something heavy in weather that doesn't let you put it down. I called a lawyer friend from my department days, a man named, I'll leave his name out of this, who had transitioned into civil practice and knew family law. I told him what I had. He listened without interrupting, which is the sign of a good attorney. And when I was done, he said, "You need to get this in front of a forensic accountant before you tell her anything. And you need to do it quietly," I said. I understood. He said, "How long do you think you have?" I said I didn't know. Maybe a few months. Maybe less, he said. "Then you need to move." I moved. I spent 4 weeks compiling everything I had into a documented record. Dates, locations, permit cross-references, photographs I'd taken through the truck window of those printed emails. Records I'd requested through public channels. I paid out of pocket for a CPA who had done forensic work on commercial fraud cases to spend a week going through what I could provide. His assessment was that the financial irregularities were significant. Conservative estimate. My daughter stood to lose access to somewhere between $140,000 and $220,000 in marital assets if the separation happened without legal intervention. In North Carolina, marital misconduct can factor into equitable distribution. Dissipation of assets is actionable. I brought everything to my daughter on a Sunday afternoon in April. Not at their house, at mine. I asked her to come alone. I told her I needed to talk to her about something important, and that I needed her full attention. She sat at the kitchen table, where she'd done homework as a teenager, and I laid it out in order. Not emotionally. Methodically. The way I'd learned to present a case. She didn't cry right away. She asked questions, which I expected. She challenged two of the things I showed her, which I also expected. And in both cases, when I walked her through the documentation, the questions resolved. By the end, she was very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something you suspected but couldn't name has been named for you. Then she did cry, and I sat there and let her, the way you do when there's nothing to fix, but you can at least make sure someone doesn't have to fall apart alone. After a while, she asked me how long I'd known. I told her the truth. Several months. She looked at me for a moment, and I couldn't entirely read what was in her face. There was grief, obviously, and anger, though not at me, or at least not mostly at me. But there was also something else, something I've turned over many times since, something that looked almost like relief. Like a person who has been holding their breath underwater and has finally been allowed to surface. She said, "I think I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" That's the question I expected, the one I'd prepared for, and also the one I still don't have a fully clean answer to. I told her, "Because I needed to make sure that when I brought it to you, you had something you could use. Not just a feeling, something real." She nodded slowly. I don't know if she accepted that entirely. I'm not sure I do either. The separation process was not fast or clean. These things never are. Her attorney filed in May. Because of the documentation I'd compiled and the forensic accounting, her legal team was able to move quickly on protective orders related to the disputed assets. Some of what he'd moved was recoverable, not all of it. In North Carolina, what you can get back depends on timing and what you can prove, and we could prove enough. He was not, as far as I know, criminally charged with anything. What he did was ugly and deceptive and financially harmful. But the line between civil fraud and criminal conduct in cases like this is one that prosecutors are cautious about. His attorney negotiated a settlement that my daughter's attorney told her was fair given the circumstances, which I suppose it was. Though fair in divorce cases is a word that means something different, depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. My grandson spent 3 months not quite understanding what was happening. He's a perceptive kid and he knew something had shifted, but at 7 years old the mechanics of marriage and separation don't fully land. He asked me once, directly, while we were building something in the garage. One of those wooden model planes we put together on weekends. He asked me if Daddy was coming home. I didn't lie to him, but I also didn't give him more than he needed. I said, "Your mom and dad are going to figure out what's best. And wherever you are, I'm going to be right there." He seemed to accept that. Or at least he went back to the model plane. There are things I've turned over since all of this resolved. Or mostly resolved, because these situations don't fully resolve. They just find a new shape you learn to live around. I've thought about whether I handled it right. I've thought about the months I spent watching and documenting while my daughter was inside a marriage that was eroding beneath her. There are moments when I think I should have told her earlier, given her more time to process it on her own terms. There are other moments when I think that moving too soon would have cost her financially in ways that couldn't be undone. I don't know that I made the right call. I made the call I made with what I knew at the time. What I do know is this. There is a version of that April afternoon where I went to her earlier, before I had the documentation, and she confronted him and he denied it, and she chose to believe him. Because that's what people do when they love someone, and the alternative is too large. And by the time the truth came out, the money was gone and the legal window had closed. That version exists. I chose not to be in it. The letter, by the way. The one I found in his bag that started all of this. I never found out exactly what it said. I never asked, and she never told me. Maybe it was something she'd written and never sent. Maybe it was something she had sent and he'd kept. Some evidence of a private struggle between two people that I was never meant to see and don't need to understand. But I've thought about it a lot. That folded piece of paper with her name on it, tucked away in a hidden pocket. Something carried privately, something not meant for anyone else. I think now that she was already trying to say something she didn't know how to say out loud. I think the letter was her, trying to find words for something she already felt but couldn't yet see clearly. I found it, I put it back, and I went and did what I could do with the part that was mine to handle. She's doing well now, my daughter. She got a smaller place in Asheville proper. She always loved it there, and she's found a kind of steadiness that I think she'll build something solid from. My grandson spends weekends with his father, which I think is right, because whatever I believe about the man, he loves that boy and the boy loves him, and those two things have to be allowed to exist separately from everything else. My daughter called me last week. She was making dinner, she said, and she just wanted to talk. We talked for almost an hour about nothing in particular. Her job, my garden, whether I'd watched the game, whether my knee was still giving me trouble. Normal things. The kind of conversation that means everything, precisely because it isn't about anything. Before she hung up, she said, "I'm glad you were paying attention, Dad." I said, "That's what I'm for," she laughed, and that was enough. Some things you do for your children will never get explained fully, not in words. You make a choice in the dark with incomplete information, and you live with the weight of it either way, because either you act and you carry the uncertainty of having interfered, or you don't act and you carry the certainty of having stood still. Neither one is clean. Neither one gets you off the hook. But there are no funerals in this story. My daughter is in her own apartment cooking dinner on a Tuesday night, and my grandson is building model planes in my garage on weekends. And I'm sitting in the same kitchen where I found that letter, under the same buzzing fluorescent light, and all of that is still true. Some fathers choose being forgiven. I chose making sure there was something left to forgive.